Great, Lily. Thank you for your answers. That really help us understand the current challenges in ESG. 好的，那接下来让我们欢迎本次访谈的最后一位嘉宾 Wendy Cruz。Wendy 是我们伦交所集团数据分析业务的客户和第三方风险亚太地区的销售总监。Wendy 在该地区的销售团队中工作，推动财务目标的达成。他拥有超过20年的经验，主要担任领导职位，与所有垂直领域的金融机构和公司合作，将数据分析和风险与合规解决方案整合到他们的工作流程中。Welcome, Wendy.
Thank you very much to the moderator for giving me this opportunity. Good morning, good afternoon, depends where you are. I'm Wendy Cruz, the Risk Proposition Director at the Refinitiv Third-Party Risk and Customer Proposition. I generally build compliance programs from the ground up for corporates, increasingly with a focus of FCPA risks. Of late, however, we're seeing a huge transition into ESG risks, and it is my honor to be presenting today.
You are very welcome, Wendy. Thanks again for joining us. My first question for you is, ESG doesn't seem to be a New Year's blip. In your opinion, is it the biggest business transformation, and what are the challenges in managing ESG risks?
It is a very popular acronym, isn't it? And I do think ESG has become one of the fastest growing movements in business and in investing, right? And this time the pitch is definitely wider. It's definitely deeper. But if you've seen this transition, I think it was really catapulted. The momentums really increase on the back of COVID-19. And the COVID-19 pandemic has really put a spotlight on business behaviors, banking, corporate behavior. It's all about business resilience as well. And it's also touched on broader sustainability issues. Now, if we look at the macro landscape, and let's look at the Asia Pacific region for a start, around 79% of investors have increased ESG investments significantly or moderately during this last year. And this was a poll that the MSCI Global Institutional Investor Survey conducted. At the same time, you've got 57% of investors in the Asia Pacific region expecting to completely or to a large extent incorporate ESG issues into their investment analysis and decision-making process. So huge momentum on the investment front. But when you look at exchanges as well in the region, they've been issuing guidelines on ESG reporting, right? And many of them have introduced mandatory ESG disclosure requirements. If you've looked beyond Asia Pacific, you've got large investors, institutional investors, like CalPERS, like CalSTRS in the US, increasingly focused on ESG performance as well. And again, globally, you're seeing fund flows into ESG funds, passive funds, index funds. I think they've all risen, substantially over the last year. Critically, stakeholder, shareholder activism on ESG issues have started to also increase in recent years. You've asked about what the challenges are. I think there are a couple. Aside from not having data transparency, I think there's still a lot of stubborn outliers that lead organizations who are fairly resistant to this change. But I think a lot of that has to do with a lack of expertise. Data quality continues to be fairly low. Methodologies are still opaque. And I don't see how we can say there's going to be some sort of a benchmark, some sort of a rating. I think we won't see very much of that happening, because at the end of the day, we're measuring goodness, aren't we? And it is quite difficult to measure goodness. And I really don't think the task is going to get easier in the short term. We've seen a lot of services pop up everywhere to measure ESG, their scores, their ratings, their benchmarks. But I don't think there really is a possibility to try and create a database of green companies, because ESG in itself covers a broad spectrum and it covers a full gamut of issues. And to really try and get visibility, there is no one cookie cutter approach. I think a lot of it will have to be centered around proprietary data that's going to be collected through technical, physical, and social audits that firms basically will have to invest time doing that. Coupled with that, I think it's a rapidly growing landscape where the regulatory environment is dynamic and it's also changing. So I hope that answers your question.
You work with numerous organizations, advising them on how to build out their risk oversight programs. In the case of Asia, which part of the acronym is getting the most attention?
So let's just start off with the macro landscape here. I think if you look at the Asia Pacific region, then we're starting off from a position of higher carbon emissions. There is definitely a growing awareness of climate change related issues, and there is rising ambition from government, NGOs, and regulators to address its impact. So we've seen the raft of net zero emission targets announced by countries in Asia Pacific, as early as, towards the end of 2020. So that's, about a year and a half ago. So it highlights how quickly the policy landscape is changing. In the UN General Assembly of last year, China pledged that the country will become carbon neutral by 2060. This was quickly followed by similar commitments from Japan and South Korea. And rightfully so, because if you look at the countries that are most threatened by and vulnerable to climate change, you'll see like the top 10 of these countries really sitting in the Asia Pacific region. And which are they? You've got Japan, we've got Philippines, Australia, India, Sri Lanka, Myanmar, and the Pacific Islands. So there's a really good percentage of these countries that are going to be badly impacted by climate change. So that really is the E in ESG, right? So I will say, in short, from a macro landscape, governments have really been focusing on addressing environmental challenges in the Pacific region. But again, we can't do this alone, right? Leading the region through hardships of a warming world is an enormous goal, but one that needs to be accomplished just as much as leading the rest of the world towards the same goal. So if we look at it from a macro standpoint, the E of ESG has definitely taken center stage over the last couple of years. And there's remarkable ambitions, initiatives that are happening as well that we're seeing. But I think the S in ESG has gained just as much prominence as much as the E has. And again, I think the pandemic has basically highlighted this, and it's pushed it into the forefront, where it's not as nebulous as it used to be. And why do I say that? Because I think the human cost of the pandemic has highlighted the importance of robust healthcare systems and treatment of employees. And so when you look at that and then you pivot to the financial markets as well, we've seen a record issuance of social bonds that have been issued. So from a micro angle, I'm noticing companies focusing just as much on the S.
You mentioned that the S is not as nebulous as it used to be. Could you give us a few examples of how regulators are responding? And could you share a case study to illustrate this and possibly challenges in identifying vulnerabilities and wrongdoings?
Sure. And before I attempt that question, I think broadly speaking, what does the S stand for? Right? The S really stands for social, but it is focused on how businesses treats its people. And it concentrates on a few things. We hear a lot about diversity, human rights, working conditions, including child labor, slavery, health and safety, and animal welfare, just to name a handful. So from a regulatory standpoint, if you look at the region, the Australian Modern Slavery Act reform has actually and will continue to make an impact on businesses. And to businesses that are operating in the region or have any dealings with the Australians, I think you should really be prepared to uplift your modern day slavery related controls. And this includes due diligence, monitoring and reporting as well. But just in the interest of time, I think I just want to spend the next couple of minutes focusing on one risk aspect, because I can't give you examples around diversity, human rights, working conditions. You hear about that all the time. But I want to talk about child exploitation in the S. You may have read about big tech giants such as Apple, Google, Microsoft, Dell, Tesla. They've been sued recently by a human rights group on behalf of families of children that have been killed or injured while mining cobalt in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And cobalt is actually used in their products. And in the class action lawsuit, the international rights advocates claims that these companies, and possibly more, have aided and abetted a supply chain for cobalt. It is, a metal critical for smartphones, electric vehicles, that forces children to work in dangerous conditions in the DRC. So that's the backdrop. We've seen that happen. But I think as an extension to child exploitation, there's another part to that is child sexual exploitation. And what is this? This is really crimes related to possessing, distributing, producing, and assessing child sexual exploitation material. Also online grooming and luring children. It is growing at an alarming pace. If you look at a 2020 report, I was looking at this, and by a not-for-profit Internet Watch Foundation, they found a 60% annual increase in child sexual abuse imagery online. So why is there this massive increase, right? What's precipitating that? I think we've got to look at what's causing this increase. And the first is we're getting a lot more internet savvy, a lot more technologically advanced. And we're seeing an exponential increase in internet access globally, including for children. So this has basically broadened the pool of children for criminals to try and groom for exploitation. So one, the exponential increase in internet access globally. And again, the pandemic has worsened the situation. Because what it's done, it's restricted the movement of many children. Many can't go to school. Many are accessing content online, right? So that's the second thing that's driving this. And we all know that the pandemic has further imposed extraordinary economic stress on many families, especially in countries at greater risk of child sexual exploitation. So the economic burden which COVID-19 has pushed many families through has made them more desperate and vulnerable to exploitation. And finally, there is rapid technological advancements. And these rapid advancements have just made this crime only easier and cheaper to produce and consume. But at the back of this, it is also safer to be engaging in this sort of crimes due to the heightened use of encryption and other technologies and services designed to avoid detection. So I think those are the four things, broadly speaking, that's kind of exacerbated this issue, this increase of child sexual exploitation. And you've asked me to maybe share a case study. And I'm going to just pick one that happened very close to us by a South Korean national. It's called Welcome to Video. And this is to demonstrate the dangers of the technological advancements that we're seeing in our days, in this day and age, really. So Welcome to Video was created by a South Korean national on the encrypted portion of the internet, darknet, where sexually explicit videos of children and teens could be bought using Bitcoin. And Bitcoin, again, took the world by storm. You know, it's still rising in popularity. But in March 2018, you know, after WTV expanded its user base to 38 countries, it was finally shut down in a very complex operation involving law enforcement agencies from several countries. Now, a few points here that makes this case unique that I'd like to flag out, the three. The site had 1.3 million Bitcoin addresses registered, and it received more than 353,000 US dollar worth of Bitcoin between 2015 to 2018. The site was the largest in terms of sheer volume of child abuse material stored, which exceeded 8 terabytes. And according to the US Department of Justice, the website was among the first of its kind to monetize child exploitation videos using Bitcoin. While most users were charged with child abuse related offenses, some were also charged with other offenses, including money laundering. So you may ask, so how do we actually prevent this We've got technological advancements. We've got anonymization technologies. We've got the pervasive use of social media applications. We've got disjointed legislations in different countries, including those with non-dissuasive penalties for child abuse. And then we've got us, the general public's preference for privacy when they're using technology. So how do you get around this? I think it's right for regulators to demand that businesses, banks, reporting institutions understand all red flags associated with wrongdoings. We're talking about child abuse now, so we'll stick with that. And to be able to analyze every transaction closely to flag red flags. Now, to be able to fight wrongdoings like this or any risk areas, but that start with child abuse, is that we need to have partnerships between like-minded organizations in the public and private sector. The government can do so much, but it is the private sector that really needs to step up. It could be through data sharing around institutions, between banks, with AML, counter financing, CFTs basically, counterterrorism financing obligations. And those partnerships have to be forged between regulators, law enforcement agencies. But a lot of it has to also come from the support from technology companies who are unhindered by privacy concerns. So you may ask, so are there such partnerships today? And I'll give you one example of a partnership that's been initiated by Austrac. And this goes back far back, it's 5 years ago, that was established in 2017. And it is a partnership that's called the Fintel Alliance. It includes major banks, remittance service providers, and gambling operators in Australia, together with law enforcement and security agencies in Australia and overseas. And a lot of that is around counterterrorism financing and anti-money laundering. Since the initiative was established, we have seen a 945% increase in banks filing suspicious transactions, reporting aligned to suspected child abuse. And that's really led to a number of arrests of offenders in Australia and the rescue of many children overseas. But moving forward, it is imperative that reporting institutions must screen against high-quality AML risk intelligence data, but it has to be curated from credible sources, both locally and globally. There is a need for us to ensure that we're collecting robust, quality KYC data on customers before screening it against the best AML reference data that is available. Part of the screening process has to be against data that is rich with identifiers, local aliases, so that we bring down the likelihood of false positives. The data should really be granular enough to allow all these reporting institutions to screen against any specific risk content sets. And this is where I think it's opportune to basically just share that that's what we do at Refinitiv. Our risk intelligence database, specifically the special interest category, and we call them 6, it plays a critical role in providing regulated institutions with data that satisfy all the stringent requirements, allowing reporting institution to meet their customer and third-party due diligence screening obligations. You may ask, what are these 6, these special interest categories? Well, they're actually classification of information that we obtain through credible media sources, sanctions, law, and regulatory enforcement sources. If I could just stick with the child exploitation case study as an example, when you deploy our special interest category, we will be tagging that specific risk area with tags such as possession and distribution of sexually explicit videos of children online, exploitation of children, sexual exploitation, illegal possession, human rights violation. And each of these tags in our SIC category classification are tagged so that our customers who have reporting regulations, commitments to fulfill their obligations locally, can actually very quickly identify these sorts of crimes. So I guess I've shared that case study with you. But all I'd say is for us to basically move forward, that in conclusion, we do need a lot more collaboration within banks, within businesses, technology organizations, law enforcement, regulators, and data providers like Refinitiv, like us. And we've been stepping up to that game via our WorldCheck SIC categories. But only through these partnerships can we actually fight financial crime, including child abuse in this case. And thank you for the invitation, for sharing my views on ESG with a focus of child exploitation.
Thank you, Wendy. Thank you for your sharing. That is some valuable information. 那么本轮 ESG 投资和数据1对1访谈环节到目前为止就告一段落。相信大家都在这2个小时的嘉宾演讲分享中找到了启发，感到受益匪浅。这也是我们举办本次展望会的目的，就是让更多的人对金融知识有自己的独到见解。再次感谢各位嘉宾为我们带来2022年伦敦证券交易所集团市场展望论坛关于 ESG 市场投资的精彩发言。谢谢各位的到来，期待我们下回见。谢谢。